The notion of a right is one of the most common moral, political, and legal categories we use. People are always talking about their rights. They talk about them in the context of politics. They talk about them in the context of law, and of course, they talk about them in the context of morality. And so it's very difficult sometimes to come to terms with just what it is we're talking about when we talk about rights. I mean, think about it. There are moral rights. We've already talked about natural rights in this class. We talk about legal rights. We talk about democratic rights. We talk about equality rights. We talk about all kinds of other forms of rights. And yet, we still need to come up with some sort of definition of just what a right is. And so the purpose of this video is to talk a little bit about what rights are and how we can conceive of where they come from and why they're justified. So there are essentially two major theories that are used to explain what rights are all about. And these are major types of theory. Within each one of them, there are going to be all kinds of subgroupings, but these are the major types of theory that we're going to find. The first one is what we call will theory. The second one is what we're going to call interest theory. Now, will theory is a type of theory that's held by those who believe that law should basically be allowing for the widest possible self-expression for individuals. Individual human beings should be able to make their own choices, and they should be able to express themselves in their actions, in their words, in their beliefs, their thoughts, and so on, such that the choices that people make should be considered inviolable a little bit. Now, this kind of theory is something that we tend to think of as being pretty obvious when we talk about rights. We don't think about it as being something that's questionable. If I have a right to something, that means I get to do it if I want. If I have a right to something, that means that if I want to go get it, I get to do that. If I want to, on the other hand, not enforce my right, well, that's up to me as well, right? I either enforce my rights, I don't enforce my rights, that's up to me. And whatever I want to do, that's what I'm going to do. So rights are, under this theory, designed to protect my actions, my decisions, and ultimately my freedom and my agency, my autonomy. Let's take an example. Marriage rights. We've been talking about marriage rights for the last 10 years or so, a little bit longer. And the question originally was this: should same-sex couples have the right to get married? Well, if we take it from the point of view of will theory, we're going to ask, do they want to get married? Is there any compelling reason why they shouldn't be allowed to get married? Is there anything inherent to the concept of marriage that means that same-sex couples shouldn't be allowed to do it? And if we can't find such a reason, then we need to allow them to do it. Why? Because of their own autonomy, because they are free agents. They are autonomous beings with minds of their own who've made a choice, and they should be permitted to follow through on that choice. So, given that there are no compelling reasons why they shouldn't be allowed, why same-sex couples shouldn't be allowed to get married, we have no reason to stop them, and therefore we have a duty as a society to not only permit marriage, but to set up the institution in such a way that it responds to same-sex couples, just as it has always responded to different-sex couples, opposite-sex couples. So we're valuing freedom, we're valuing personal autonomy. Pardon me. Now take that same example from the point of view of interest theory. Interest theory is going to say, well, hold on now. Yes, people want to do it, but why do they want to do it? Marriage itself brings with it a number of social, economic, cultural, religious, personal benefits that really are good for people and that people really want and really need. And denying someone marriage is to deny them those kinds of benefits. It's to refuse to allow them to obtain or benefit from certain types of social goods. Now, we need to be very, very careful if we're going to justify that kind of denial. But more than that, if we deny people certain social goods based on who they are, then what we end up doing is stigmatizing people for no good reason. And that harms people. It doesn't benefit them at all. So, therefore, society has a duty to permit same-sex marriage, to in fact permit everyone to marry whomever they wish. Why? Well, because of these benefits that we're talking about. Therefore, same-sex couples ought to have a legal right to marry, and therefore they also have a moral right and a political right that should be recognized as well. So will theory is based on freedom, autonomy, and choice, whereas interest theory is based on what's best for people. We have rights because of our need to protect our interests. So that's the key difference between them. From a practical point of view, many of us are going to be interested usually in maybe combining these two theories, maybe talking about will theory in certain contexts and interest theory in other contexts. But philosophers want to figure out which theory best explains the phenomena we're trying to explain. And in this case, it's generally taken that interest theory is going to be the one that's going to work best. In fact, interest theory is often offered as an explanation of how we can meet the problems of will theory. So when we present interest theory, we're presenting an idea that really is supposed to account for the difficulties that come from will theory. But what are the problems that come from will theory? Well, let's think of a couple here. I want you to notice the importance of choice. I've made this point a couple of times. Will theory protects my choices. So if I have freedom of speech, will theory protects my choice to speak or to not speak. And it's only under certain rather extreme and clearly defined kinds of circumstances that you would say, I don't have the right to freedom of speech. But I can also get rid of or not get rid, but I can also waive my right to speech. I can choose not to speak. I can choose to let someone else speak on my behalf. Well, what does this imply? It implies that I could potentially waive any right. If I have the right to choose, and if the basis for my rights is in fact the choices that I make, my ability to choose, my ability to act as a free agent, if that's the basis for my rights, well, one of the choices I can make is not to enforce my rights. I can choose to, for example, if you owe me money, I can choose not to collect the money. Even though you have an obligation to pay me and I have the right to receive it, I can choose to forgive the debt. Why do I have that power? Well, that's simply because I'm a free agent. I have agency and autonomy, and therefore I can say to you, yes, I have the right to that money, but I'm going to waive that right. So that's fine. But what if the right I'm going to waive is something like the right to life? Can I choose to just abandon or give up my right to life? Well, maybe in wartime or something like that, I could choose to do that by becoming a soldier and going onto the battlefield. But even then, am I giving up my right to life? Or am I giving up my right to fight to stay alive? It's a little bit dicey. But suppose I decide to give up my right not to be tortured. Can I give up my right not to be tortured to some political actor who wants to get information from me? Suppose or to some sadist who wants to torture me and kill me? Can I give up that right? And most people will say, no, I cannot give up the right to be tortured to death, for example. So that's a big problem. The question is, why can't I give up that right? And can will theory account for that? Well, will theory can probably account for at least some of these objections by talking about the greater importance of some rights compared to the lesser importance of others. And that's potentially doable. But on the other hand, there are some really serious problems here anyway. For example, what if I decide to give up the right not to be enslaved? Can I voluntarily give up my right not to be a slave? The problem with that, as J.S. Mill pointed out, is that if I were to give up my right not to be enslaved, that would also imply giving up all my freedom to choose forever. And the question is, can I do that? The answer is probably not. And that's a problem for will theory. Interest theory can explain it. Interest theory can talk about my right to be not to be tortured and my right to live as being elements of my interest, things that are in my interest, and therefore I have rights to them. And I cannot always waive these kinds of rights, like the right not to be made a slave. Some rights are held by children. This is a second problem. What about the rights of children? Well, a lot of the rights of children have to do with things that other people, not the child, can choose to do. So often the rights of a child are expressed in terms of the rights of the parents. But it's one thing to have a right, and it's another thing to have a right and then someone else acts. The rights of the child don't translate automatically into rights of parents as easily. This is difficult to express in terms of the will or the choice or the agency of the child. Whereas if I choose to express this in terms of the interests of the child, then I can talk about the rights of the child in terms of parental rights, and it makes much, much more sense. So that's another kind of issue where we might have some problems. Another problem with will theory comes up, for example, when we try to extend rights beyond not just adult humans who can make choices because they are free agents, but perhaps to other kinds of beings on the planet. So for a very long time, for my entire life, there's been a push to recognize animal rights. The rights of animals, the great apes, vertebrates, but ultimately all animals, is difficult to express in terms of rights of choice theory, of will theory. It might be doable. Some animals seem able to make certain kinds of choices, but certainly they aren't agents. They don't have agency in the way that humans have agency. So it's difficult to express animal rights if we want to assert those in terms of will theory. But it's even harder to do something else that's starting to be done on a regular basis now around the world. Rivers, mountains, seashores, lakes, geographical formations of various kinds are being declared to have rights. How do I explain the rights of, for example, rocks, or the rights of rivers or of mountains, or the rights of a certain ecosystem in terms of will theory? I simply can't. I can't express it in terms of the human will, and I can't express it in terms of the will of the mountain, because if the mountain has a will, it's not expressed in any way that a human could recognize, I don't think. On the other hand, I can certainly express it in terms of interest theory, and I can express it in terms of the interests of humans, as well as the interests of the mountain or the river or whatever it is. So interest theory is generally believed to be superior as a philosophical theory to will theory in terms of explaining what rights are and why we have them. And that's why, in general, that's the one we're going to be seeing. However, we can't just write will theory off completely. I mean, no less a theorist than H.L.A. Hart was a will theorist. So we do have to take the theory seriously and account for its problems, but also be ready to see it defended in ways that might sometimes make sense. Now, do we necessarily need to pick between them? Maybe not all the time, but my supposition is that if one of them can generally express the ideas of rights, that is connected to rights in a way that's better than the other, then we should probably just go with it. And so interest theory is the one that I would suggest we go with as a general rule.